There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their immense weight hidden within the folds of a Tuesday night or the quiet hum of a refrigerator. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They simply settle, and it's only much later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the precise coordinate where everything changed. For me, that moment was the specific pressure of Leo's head resting on my collarbone, his breathing a slow, warm tide against my neck, and the silent, deafening question that hung in the air between us, unspoken but as solid as the wall behind me. He was asleep, or at least pretending to be, and I was performing my own careful imitation of stillness, my entire world having contracted to the space of this worn-out sofa and the body of the man I had loved in silence for nearly a decade. This was the precipice. I knew, with the kind of primal certainty that bypasses thought, that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, the delicate architecture of our friendship would shatter. And if I didn't, I would be lost to it forever. We had met in a sophomore-level photography class, a prerequisite I was taking for my major, and one he was taking to fill a fine arts credit he'd put off for too long. I was the quiet one in the back, the one who lived in the darkroom, my hands perpetually smelling of fixer and stop bath. I found a strange comfort in the alchemical process of it, of watching images emerge from nothingness under the safe, red glow of the lamps. It was a world I could control, a narrative I could shape frame by frame. Leo was the opposite of a controlled narrative. He was all bright light and kinetic energy, the kind of person who seemed to fill every room he entered, not with arrogance, but with an effortless, gravitational warmth. He was a software engineering major, his mind a landscape of logic and code that was utterly foreign to my own. He sat in the front row, asked loud questions, and befriended the professor within the first week. He was, in every conceivable way, out of my league. Our friendship started not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet observation. He'd stayed late one afternoon, struggling with an assignment on light and shadow. He was trying to capture the way the late-day sun cut across the campus quad, but his shots were all blown out, the highlights clipped, the shadows muddy and indistinct. I watched him from the door of the darkroom for a few minutes, his brow furrowed in a frustration that was so uncharacteristic of his usual easygoing nature. I almost retreated back into my silent, red-lit world, but something in his posture, a slight slump in his broad shoulders, pulled me forward. I cleared my throat, a sound that felt ridiculously loud in the empty classroom. "You're metering for the whole scene," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He startled, turning to look at me, and his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of hazel, widened in surprise. He'd probably never even noticed me before. "You need to meter for the highlights," I continued, gesturing vaguely towards his camera. "The sun, then underexposed by a stop or two. Your camera's sensor can pull detail out of the shadows, but once a highlight is pure white, that information is gone forever. It's just nothing." He stared at me for a long moment, then a slow grin spread across his face. It was like watching the sunrise. "Gone forever," he repeated, a note of amusement in his voice. "That sounds dramatic." I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, my own self-consciousness of physical weight. I was used to the language of my craft, the small poetry of its technicalities, but hearing it reflected back at me by him made it sound pretentious. "No, I mean, it's just data," I mumbled, looking at the floor. But he just chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound. "Show me," he said. And so I did. I stepped into his space, my fingers hovering over the dials of his camera, the warmth of him radiating beside me. I showed him how to use the spot meter, how to lock the exposure, how to frame the shot not for the brightness, but for the story the shadows were telling. He took the picture, and when he pulled it up on the little screen, a perfectly balanced image of golden light and deep, detailed shadow, he let out a low whistle. "Julian, right?" he asked, and the fact that he knew my name sent a ridiculous, unwarranted jolt through my system. I just nodded. "Man," he said, shaking his head and smiling at the camera. "You're like some kind of photo wizard." That was the beginning, the foundation of us. He was fascinated by my quiet, methodical world, and I was mesmerized by his bright, chaotic one. He started seeking me out, asking for my help, but it quickly bled out of the confines of the classroom. He wanted to see my other work. He came to the darkroom and watched, captivated, as I submerged a blank sheet of paper in the developer and a face, a landscape, a moment I had stolen from time, slowly bloomed into existence. He called it magic. For me, it was just patience. He started inviting me to things, pulling me gently out of my shell. We'd study together in the library, his impenetrable textbooks on algorithms and data structures spread out next to my monographs on Cartier-Bresson and Sally Mann. He'd explain his work to me, drawing diagrams on napkins, his passion making the abstract concepts feel almost tangible. In return, I'd try to explain why a certain photograph worked, why the composition led the eye just so, why the grain felt like a memory. He was, and I say this with all the affection in the world, a jock. Not in the stereotypical, cruel sense, but in the way his body was always in motion. He was on the university's club soccer team, and I started going to his games, a camera with a long lens slung over my shoulder. I told myself it was good practice for capturing motion, for freezing a moment of peak action. But that was a lie I told myself to make it feel less like worship. The truth was, I just loved to watch him. I loved the fierce concentration on his face, the way his body moved with such power and grace, the sheer, unadulterated joy he radiated when he scored a goal. I have hundreds of photos of him from those years. Most of them are technically perfect, sharp, well-composed, capturing the decisive moment. But the ones I kept, the ones printed and stored in a box under my bed, were the other ones. The in-between moments. A shot of him, hands on his knees, catching his breath, a small, weary smile on his face. A frame of him laughing with a teammate on the sidelines, his head thrown back. A picture of him looking for someone in the small crowd, his eyes scanning the bleachers. For a while, I let myself pretend he was looking for me. My feelings for him grew so slowly, so insidiously, that I barely noticed them taking root. It wasn't a sudden crash of lightning. It was more like the patient, relentless erosion of a coastline. One day, he was my friend, my best friend, the person who knew me better than anyone. The next, the thought of his hand brushing mine sent a current through my entire body. It was a terrifying realization, because Leo was unequivocally straight. He moved through a world of easy flirtations and short-lived, passionate relationships with women who were as bright and sunny as he was. I met them all. There was Emily, and then Kate, and then, for a long and serious time, there was Sarah. Each one was lovely, and each one, in her own way, was a confirmation of the unbridgeable distance between us. I learned to be the perfect, supportive friend. I listened to him talk about his dates, offered advice, and smiled through the pang in my chest when he would talk about how amazing his new girlfriend was. I built a fortress around my heart, a carefully constructed space where my love for him could live, contained and harmless. It was a lonely place, but it was safe. The friendship was too precious to risk. I would rather have him in my life as a friend than not at all. It became my mantra. It was a truth I repeated to myself so often that I almost believed it. I was the quiet observer, the photographer. My role was to witness his life, not to be a central part of its romantic narrative. I accepted this, or I thought I had. The shift began with the end of him and Sarah. Theirs had been the longest, the most serious. They had been together for almost 3 years, had moved in together after graduation, had talked about marriage in that vague, someday kind of way that seemed to cement their future. I had photographed their housewarming party. I have a picture of them from that night, standing in the middle of their new living room, surrounded by friends. Leo's arm is around her, and he's looking down at her with an expression of such profound, gentle love that it physically hurt me to look at the print later. I buried it at the bottom of the box with the others. Sarah was smart and kind and funny, and she understood Leo in a way I thought no one else could. She understood his restlessness, his need to be in motion, the way his mind worked in sprints of intense focus. I genuinely liked her, which only made the dull ache in my chest more complicated. I wanted him to be happy. I truly did. and he was happy with her. Their breakup wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow, quiet collapse. Leo's job as a consultant required him to travel constantly. He was always living out of a suitcase, flying from one city to another, putting out fires for different companies. He thrived on the pressure, on the problem-solving, but the constant motion began to wear on him, and it wore on their relationship. He'd come home, exhausted and jet-lagged, wanting only to decompress in silence, while Sarah, who had been holding down their shared life in his absence, wanted to connect, to talk, to go out. They started operating on different frequencies, their shared language developing a painful static. He told me about it in fragments, during late-night calls from sterile hotel rooms in cities he could barely name. I listened, offering what little I could. "It's just a rough patch," I'd say. "You guys will figure it out." I was a good friend. I was a liar. The end came on a rainy Tuesday in October. He called me, his voice hollow. "She's gone, Jules," he said. That was all. He didn't say she left him, or they broke up, just that she was gone. The finality of it was chilling. "I'm coming over," I said, not asking. His apartment, the one he had shared with her, felt vast and empty when I arrived. Boxes were neatly stacked in the living room, labeled with her elegant handwriting. The space was eerily clean, scrubbed of her presence. The air itself felt thin. Leo was sitting on the floor, leaning against the sofa, staring at a blank television screen. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his usual vibrant energy completely extinguished. He looked like a photograph that had been left in the developer for too long, the details bleached out, leaving only a ghost of an image. I didn't say anything. I just sat down on the floor next to him, leaving a respectful foot of space between us. We sat there in silence for what must have been an hour, the only sound the drumming of the rain against the window pane. I didn't know what to do. My usual role was to listen, but he wasn't talking. My heart ached for him, for the genuine, gut-wrenching pain he was clearly in. But tangled within that sympathy was a selfish, shameful thread of something else. A flicker of hope so faint and so monstrous that I immediately tried to snuff it out. He was my best friend, and he was broken. That was all that mattered. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy. She said I wasn't really there, even when I was home. She said it felt like living with a ghost. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements slow, exhausted. And the worst part is, she was right. I was so focused on the next flight, the next project, the next problem to solve. I forgot how to just be here. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were wrecked. "How do you do it, Jules? How are you so good at just being still?" The question caught me off guard. Me, who felt like a perpetually vibrating tuning fork of anxiety and unspoken feelings around him. Me, whose stillness was a carefully constructed defense mechanism. I was an expert at being still because I was terrified of what would happen if I moved. "I don't know," I answered honestly. I think maybe I'm just better at hiding the motion." He seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. He leaned his head back against the sofa cushion and closed his eyes. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Less empty, more companionable. After a while, he murmured, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "Can you stay? I don't want to be alone in this place tonight." "Of course," I said instantly. And that night, the ritual began. It was born from his grief and my loyalty. I didn't want to take the bed he had shared with her, and the guest room felt too formal, too distant. So I took the couch. He eventually retreated to his bedroom, closing the door behind him, and I was left alone in the cavernous living room, listening to the sounds of a house grieving. I didn't sleep much. I just listened, my senses on high alert, as if by my vigilance I could somehow stand guard over his pain. This was the new landscape of our friendship. I was no longer just the observer. I was the sentinel. In the weeks that followed, my apartment became his sanctuary. He never explicitly asked to stay over. It just began to happen. He'd come over after work, utterly drained, a ghost haunting his own skin. We'd order food, put on a movie we had no intention of watching, and he'd stretch out on my sofa, his feet propped up on the coffee table. My sofa was smaller than his, a comfortable but undeniably intimate space. At first, he kept to his side. But as the nights wore on, the exhaustion would win, and the carefully maintained distance between us would begin to dissolve. It started with his foot accidentally brushing against my leg. Then, he would fall asleep, his head lolling back against the cushions. And then, one night, he shifted in his sleep, his body slumping sideways until his head came to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. Every nerve ending was screaming. His hair, which always smelled faintly of mint and something uniquely him, was tickling my chin. I could feel the warmth of him seeping through my shirt, a dangerous, addictive heat. I sat there, petrified, for what felt like an eternity, my own arm trapped awkwardly between his back and the sofa. My mind was a frantic storm of analysis. This means nothing, one part of me insisted. He's asleep. He's exhausted and grieving. He's just seeking comfort, the way a child would. It's platonic. It's meaningless. But another part of me, the part one had kept locked away for so long, whispered, this means everything. The weight of him, the trust of him, the simple, unconscious act of seeking me out for physical comfort, it felt like a confession. I didn't move. I let him sleep. I sat there until my own muscles ached with the strain of my stillness, until the blue light of the television had long since faded to black and the first hints of dawn were painting the sky outside my window. When he finally stirred, he pulled back slowly, blinking, a confused look on his face as he registered his position. "Oh man," he mumbled, rubbing his neck. "Sorry. I must have crashed hard." He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood up, stretched, and headed for the bathroom. He never mentioned it. And because he didn't, I didn't. We pretended it hadn't happened. But it had. A line had been crossed, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in a slow, sleepy stumble. And the silence that followed was charged with the memory of it. It became our unspoken routine. Movie nights on my couch. He'd arrive, shed the armor of his day, and slowly, inevitably, gravitate towards me. The pretense of watching the film became thinner and thinner. The space between us on the sofa shrank from a respectable distance to a suggestion, and then to nothing at all. He would lean against me almost immediately, his long frame folded against mine, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder, or, more and more often, in my lap. I would sit, my back against the arm of the sofa, and he would lie with his head pillowed on my thighs, his eyes closed, his breathing evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. I would look down at him, at the way his eyelashes cast faint shadows on his cheeks, at the slight furrow that would sometimes appear between his brows even in sleep, and my heart would perform a painful, complicated gymnastics routine in my chest. During those long, quiet hours, with him asleep and the city humming outside my window, I studied him. It was like being in the darkroom again. I was observing a precious, delicate image, terrified that any sudden movement, any change in the chemistry, would ruin it forever. I learned the topography of his face, the exact pattern of the freckles scattered across his nose. I learned the way his hand would twitch just before he fell into a deep sleep, his fingers sometimes uncurling to brush against my leg. I would rest my hand on his hair, my fingers sinking into the thick, soft strands. It was a transgression I only allowed myself when I was absolutely certain he was asleep. The touch was a desperate, silent conversation. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I love you." The words were a scream inside my head, but my hand was gentle, my touch light as a feather. His need for this strange, undefined comfort seemed to grow. He traveled less for a while, his company assigning him to a local project, and so he was at my apartment almost every night. He started leaving things there. A toothbrush in a mug by the sink, a change of clothes in my closet, a pair of running shoes by the door. My small, one-bedroom apartment began to feel like a shared space, our lives overlapping in a way that was both wonderful and terrifying. He had a key. He'd let himself in while I was out, and I'd come home to find him already on the couch, waiting for me. The domesticity of it was a sweet, sharp ache. We were playing house, but we had never read the rules. We were building something together, but we had no blueprint. He started staying the night more often than not. At first, He'd take the couch after I went to my own bed. I'd lie awake, staring at my ceiling, hyper-aware of his presence just one room away. I could hear him shift on the cushions, the faint sigh he'd let out as he settled. It was an intimacy that felt both profound and painfully incomplete. I was on one side of a wall, and he was on the other. It felt like a metaphor for our entire relationship. Then came the next shift. One night, after a particularly grueling week, he looked even more exhausted than usual. As I got up to go to bed, he looked up at me from the sofa, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Hey, Jules," he said, his voice low. "My back is killing me from this couch." I froze, my hand on the doorframe of my bedroom. You can take my bed if you want," I offered, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet room. "I can sleep out here." It was the gentlemanly thing to do, the friend thing to do. He shook his head, a small, tired smile on his face. "No, man, that's your bed." He paused, and in that pause, the entire atmosphere of the room seemed to thicken, to charge with a new, unspoken possibility. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at his hands. "It's a big bed," he said, so quietly I wondered if I had imagined it. My heart stopped. It literally just ceased to beat for a second. A big bed. He wasn't asking to take my bed. He was asking to share it. The silence stretched, filled with the frantic pounding of my own blood in my ears. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming. This is the point of no return. Say no. Protect the friendship. Protect yourself. But the part of me that had been starving for a decade was louder. "Okay," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant, unfamiliar. He finally looked up, and the relief in his eyes was so naked, so profound, that it stole my breath. He didn't smile. He just nodded, a quick, grateful dip of his chin. That first night was an exercise in excruciating self-control. My bed, which had always felt spacious, suddenly felt impossibly small. I lay on the very edge of my side, my back to him, my body as rigid as a board. I could feel the heat of him, even through the inches of space and the layers of blankets between us. I could hear every breath he took. I was listening for any sign, any signal. Was he awake? Was he thinking what I was thinking? Or was he just a tired man who wanted a more comfortable place to sleep? I lay there for hours, feigning sleep, my mind racing. This means nothing. This means everything. And then, the final, most baffling piece of the ritual fell into place. He had his own apartment, a perfectly good bed just a 20-minute drive away. Yet he chose to be here. He chose to be with me. After that first night, sharing the bed became the new normal. We didn't talk about it. He'd come over, we'd fall into our couch routine, and then, at some point, one of us would wordlessly get up and head to the bedroom, and the other would follow. But the most significant part wasn't the sharing of the bed itself. It was the door, my bedroom door. When he started staying over, he'd go to his room and close the door. When I stayed on his couch, the door was a solid, definitive barrier. But in my apartment, after he started sharing my bed, a new pattern emerged. He would go into the bedroom, first while I was cleaning up the kitchen or brushing my teeth. And he would leave the door ajar. Just a crack. A sliver of light from the hallway cutting into the darkness. It was an invitation. It had to be. It was plausible deniability in architectural form. It wasn't a grand, flung-open gesture. It was a question asked in a whisper. "Are you coming?" I would stand in the hallway, my heart hammering, and I would look at that sliver of light. It felt like a threshold between two worlds. The world where we were just friends, and a world I was too terrified to even name. Every night, I would push the door open, slip into the room, and climb into my side of the bed. And every night, I would lie there in the dark, my body humming with a painful, hopeful energy, and I would wonder, what are we doing? The physical space between us and the bed began to shrink, just as it had on the couch. It happened by degrees. A foot brushing against mine in the night, a hand thrown out in sleep that landed on my back. And then, he started turning towards me in his sleep. I would wake in the middle of the night to find him facing me, his arm draped over my waist, his face just inches from mine. His breath would be warm on my cheek. I would lie there, pinned by his weight and my own fear, and I would just exist in the moment. I would memorize the smell of his skin, the soft, rumbling sound he made in the back of his throat when he was deeply asleep. I would allow myself this stolen intimacy, this temporary illusion that this was real, that this was chosen. In the morning, he would be back on his side of the bed, the space between us restored, the night's transgressions erased by the morning light. We never, ever spoke of it. The silence was our collaborator, the architect of this strange, fragile world we had built. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety and dizzying hope. My work suffered. I would go into the darkroom and find myself unable to focus, my mind replaying the feeling of his arm around me, the sound of his breathing in the dark. I was developing feelings, but the image was refusing to resolve. It was all a murky gray of maybes and what-ifs. He was a puzzle I couldn't solve. He was my best friend, who I knew inside and out. And he was a complete stranger, a man who shared my bed and my life, but never his thoughts. He sought physical intimacy with a hunger that was palpable, yet he never made a move, never said a word that would give it a name. Was he just using me for comfort? Was I a convenient, warm body to ward off the loneliness of his new life? The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. Or was he as confused and terrified as I was, standing on his own side of a threshold he didn't know how to cross? The breaking point came, as they always do, on a night that started just like any other. It was a Thursday. He had flown back from a short trip to Chicago that afternoon, and he was frayed at the edges, the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from recycled air and airport terminals. He'd come straight to my place from the airport, dropping his bag by the door with a weary sigh. We didn't even bother with a movie. We just sat on the couch, the comfortable silence wrapping around us. He leaned his head on my shoulder, and I could feel the tension radiating from him in waves. I instinctively put my arm around him, pulling him a little closer, a gesture that had become second nature. He sighed, a deep, shuddering sound, and seemed to melt against me. We stayed like that for a long time. The room grew dark as the sun set, but I didn't move to turn on a lamp. The darkness felt safer, a blanket for the things we couldn't say. Usually, by this point, he would have drifted off to sleep. But tonight, he was awake. I could feel it. There was a tautness in his body, a subtle alertness that belied his relaxed posture. I kept my own breathing even, pretending I didn't notice. I was staring at the window, at the distant, glittering lights of the city, when his voice, low and thick with something I couldn't identify, cut through the silence. "Jules." "Yeah," I said, my own voice quiet. He didn't move. He just lay there, his head on my shoulder, his voice aimed at the space in front of us. "Are you happy?" The question was so simple, so direct, and yet it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't the casual "how are you?" or "what's up?" It was a surgical strike, aimed directly at the heart of the fortress I had so carefully constructed. People didn't ask me that. They saw my quiet demeanor, my solitary hobbies, and they assumed I was content in my small, ordered world. But Leo had always seen more. He was the only one who had ever bothered to look past the surface. And he was asking now, in this room, in this darkness, with his body pressed against mine. My first instinct was to lie, to give the easy answer. Yeah, of course, to keep the peace, to maintain the status quo, to not disturb the fragile ecosystem of our arrangement. It was the safe answer. It was the answer the friend was supposed to give. But I was so tired. I was tired of the pretending, of the analyzing, of the silent screaming inside my own head. I was tired of living in the gray space, of developing a photograph that would never come into focus. I looked down at the top of his head, at the whirl of his dark hair, and for the first time in a very long time, I decided to tell the truth. My voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the quiet room. No, the word hung in the air between us. It was a stark, lonely thing. I felt his body tense slightly against mine. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I felt a surge of panic. I had done it. I had broken the spell. I had admitted a crack in my foundation, and now everything was going to come crashing down. He was going to pull away, create distance, and the strange, beautiful, painful world we had built would dissolve. But he didn't pull away. He shifted, lifting his head from my shoulder. He turned his body on the couch to face me. In the dim light filtering in from the street, I could just make out his expression. It was serious, searching. His eyes were fixed on mine. "Why not?" he asked, his voice still low, but now laced with a raw, genuine concern. And I broke, not in a flood of tears, but in a quiet, steady unraveling. The fortress crumbled. The walls came down. "Because of this," I whispered, my voice trembling. I made a vague gesture to the space between us, to the couch, to the room, to the entire unspoken thing that had taken over our lives. "Because I don't know what this is, Leo. And I'm terrified that I'm the only one who needs it to be something." The confession was out, a wounded animal let loose in the room. I couldn't look at him. I stared at my hands, at the faint tremor in my fingers. I had just detonated our friendship. 10 years of it, gone, because I was too weak, too tired to keep lying. The silence that followed was the most terrifying of my life. It was not the comfortable silence we knew. It was a vacuum, devoid of air, of meaning. I waited for him to get up. I waited for the apology, the awkward explanation, the gentle but firm retreat. I waited for the end. Instead, I felt his hand. He reached out and gently took my hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm, grounding. He didn't say anything. He just held my hand, his thumb stroking slowly over my knuckles. It was a simple, profound anchor in the storm of my panic. After what felt like a lifetime, he spoke. His voice was thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "You think you're the only one?" he said, his voice cracking on the last word. I finally dared to look up at him. His face was a landscape of conflict, his brows drawn together, his mouth a tight line. But his eyes were filled with a startling, heartbreaking vulnerability. "Jules," he whispered, and my name sounded different, like a word he was learning to say for the first time. "I have no idea what I'm doing. I just know that when I'm not here, when I'm in some hotel room in some city I don't care about, nothing feels real. It's all just noise. And when I come here, it's the only time anything is quiet. It's the only time I feel." He trailed off, searching for the word. "Home, home." He had taken the word right out of my heart and spoken it aloud. He squeezed my hand tighter. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I'm so sorry, Julian. I've been so selfish. I've been hiding here, in your quiet, and I never stopped to ask what it was costing you." He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. His eyes were shining in the dim light. "You're not the only one who needs this to be something," he said, his voice barely audible. I'm so scared of what that something is." And there it was. The truth. Not just my truth, but his. We were both terrified. We were both standing on the same threshold, looking at each other across the divide. He was not the unknowing initiator. He was the knowing, terrified initiator. He had been leaving the door ajar not as an accident, but as a plea. His fear was not of me, but of himself, of what wanting this meant, of appending the entire narrative of his life, the one he thought was already written. He leaned in, his movement slow, tentative. It was not a move of passion or confidence. It was a question. His face was so close now, I could feel his breath on my lips. His eyes searched mine, asking for permission, for confirmation, for a sign that he was not alone in this freefall. I didn't know what to do, so I just did the only thing that felt real. I closed the small distance between us. It wasn't a kiss of fireworks or movie scene perfection. It was hesitant. It was clumsy. It was just the soft, uncertain pressure of my lips against his. It was chapped lips and the faint taste of coffee and the scratch of his evening stubble. It was terrifying, and it was the most honest thing I had ever done. I pulled back after only a second, my heart a wild bird in my chest. He didn't move. His eyes were closed, and an expression of something like profound relief washed over his face. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He opened his eyes, and they were glistening. He lifted his other hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a touch so tender it made me ache. "Okay," he whispered. To me, or to himself, I wasn't sure. Okay. That one word was everything. It was permission. It was acceptance. It was the beginning. He leaned in again, and this time, the kiss was different. It was still gentle, still questioning, but there was a current of certainty underneath it. It was a conversation without words, a slow, careful exploration. It was the taste of years of unspoken friendship, of shared laughter, of silent, lonely nights. It was the taste of coming home. We didn't say another word. We just stayed there, on the couch, in the dark, learning the shape of this new, fragile, beautiful thing we had just allowed to be born. The morning after was a landscape of sheer terror. I woke up first, tangled in my sheets, the space beside me empty and cold. For a disoriented moment, I thought I had dreamt it all. The confession, the kiss, the feeling of his hand in mine. But then I saw his wallet and keys on my nightstand, and the memory came crashing back, vivid and terrifyingly real. I crept out of the bedroom. The apartment was silent. He wasn't on the couch. A quick check of the bathroom confirmed it was empty. His bag was gone from its place by the door. He was gone. He had fled. The panic that seized me was cold and absolute. I had misread everything. The kiss had been a mistake, a moment of grief-induced confusion for him. And now, in the clear, harsh light of day, he had realized it and run. I had forced his hand, and in doing so, I had shattered the most important relationship of my life. The silence in the apartment was no longer companionable. It was mocking, accusatory. It was the sound of my own loneliness rushing back in to fill the space he had vacated. I spent the next 2 days in a self-imposed purgatory. I replayed every second of that night, dissecting every word, every gesture. His confession of fear, which had felt so honest at the time, now seemed like a gentle way of letting me down. His kiss, which had felt like a beginning, now felt like a goodbye. He didn't call. He didn't text. My phone, which had been a constant source of connection to him, was now a silent monument to my stupidity. I felt a familiar, hollow ache settle deep in my chest. I had gambled everything on a single moment of honesty, and I had lost. The fortress I had dismantled lay in ruins around me, and I had no idea how to even begin to rebuild it. I was exposed, raw, and profoundly alone. The hope that had been a tentative flicker was now extinguished, leaving behind a bitter, smoky residue of regret. I had finally seen the image resolve, and it was a picture of my own foolish heart, overexposed and ruined. By the 3rd day, the pain had curdled into a quiet, simmering anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, for leaving me in this agonizing limbo. But mostly, an anger at myself for allowing the silence to continue. Our entire relationship, this whole fragile structure, had been built on a foundation of things unsaid. I had let his silence dictate the terms for months, for years. I had let my own fear of confrontation keep me a prisoner. I wasn't going to do it anymore. If our friendship was truly over, if I had truly ruined it, then I deserved to hear it from him. I deserved more than a ghosting. I deserved an ending, not just an absence. I found my car keys, my movements stiff, robotic. I drove to his apartment, the one he had once shared with Sarah, the place I hadn't been since the night of their breakup. My heart hammered against my ribs with a sick, frantic rhythm. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that the silence had become more painful than any truth he could possibly tell me. I parked on the street and stared up at his window. The lights were on. He was home. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hand on the door handle, my courage failing me. But then I thought of the past few days, of the agonizing uncertainty, and a wave of resolve washed over me. I got out of the car and walked to his front door before I could change my mind. I rang the bell. The sound echoed the frantic beat of my own heart. I heard movement inside, then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened, and he was standing there. He looked awful. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on 2 days ago. His hair was a mess, and there were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. He just stared at me, his face a mask of shock and something else, something that looked like guilt. "Julian," he breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, a human barrier. The sight of him, so broken and lost, extinguished my anger, replacing it with a deep, weary sadness. "You could have texted," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the storm of emotion I was feeling. You could have just sent one word. Sorry, mistake, anything. Anything would have been better than just disappearing. He flinched, as if I had physically struck him. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I know, he mumbled. I'm sorry. I'm such a coward. Why, Leo? I asked, and my voice cracked, the raw hurt finally breaking through my composure. What was so terrifying that you had to run? Was it me? Was the kiss that repulsive? The word tasted like poison. No, he said, his head snapping up, his eyes wide with alarm. God, no, Jules, it wasn't you. It was never you. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure desperation. It was me. I woke up the next morning, and you were there, sleeping, and it was perfect. It felt so right. And that's what scared the hell out of me. He finally stepped back from the door, a gesture of surrender. Come in, he said quietly. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were strewn over chairs. It was the landscape of a breakdown. He didn't offer me a seat. We just stood in the middle of the living room, a few feet apart, the air thick with unspoken things. I've spent my whole life on a track, you know, he began, his voice low and ragged. High school, college, the right major, the right job, the right girlfriend. There was always a plan, a blueprint. I knew what my life was supposed to look like. And Sarah was part of that plan, a huge part of it. He paced back and forth, his movements agitated. And when that fell apart, I was lost, completely adrift. And you were my anchor. You were the only solid thing in the whole damn world. He stopped pacing and faced me. But I told myself it was just friendship. I told myself I needed my best friend. The cuddling, sharing a bed. I justified all of it. I told myself it was just comfort. Platonic. Because the alternative was too huge. It would mean that the entire blueprint was wrong. That I was wrong. That I don't know who I am at all. His voice dropped to a whisper. And then you kissed me. And it wasn't platonic. And it felt like the first true thing that's happened to me in years. And I panicked. I looked at this life I thought I was supposed to want. And I looked at you. And I realized that what I actually want, it terrifies me. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. It's not you I'm scared of, Julian. I'm scared of myself. I'm scared of what this means, of telling people, of changing everything. I'm scared of not being the person everyone thinks I am. The person I thought I was. It was a confession born of pure exhaustion and fear. He had finally named the ghost that had been haunting us. Not the ghost of his past relationship, but the ghost of his own expectations, of a life he had been trying to build from the wrong plans. I closed the distance between us, my own fear dissolving in the face of his. I reached out and took his hand. It was cold. Leo, I said softly. Look at me. He reluctantly lifted his gaze to mine. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You don't need a new blueprint. You just have to not run. You just have to stay. I squeezed his hand. We can be scared together. Okay. We can just be here, in the mess, and figure it out one day at a time. But you can't disappear on me again. I can't do that again. Tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He just nodded, a jerky, desperate movement. Okay, he choked out. Okay. I'm sorry. I won't. He pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me tightly, desperately. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I could feel him shaking. It wasn't a hug of passion. It was a hug of pure, desperate relief. It was the hug of a man who had been drowning and had finally found something solid to hold on to. I held him, my own arms wrapped around his back, and I just breathed. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The silence was finally broken, and in its place, we had found a new, fragile, and terrifyingly honest beginning. The days that followed our confrontation were not a seamless transition into romantic bliss. They were awkward and tentative and achingly gentle. We were two people who knew each other's souls, but were now learning the foreign language of a new kind of intimacy. We were relearning how to exist in the same space. The first time he came back to my apartment, he stood in the doorway, uncertain, as if he needed a new invitation. I just smiled, took his hand, and pulled him inside. We didn't fall into our old couch routine. Instead, we sat at my small kitchen table and talked. We talked for hours. We talked about his fears, about my years of silence, about the what-ifs and the maybes. It was like lancing a wound, painful and messy, but utterly necessary for the healing to begin. That night, when we went to bed, the dynamic had shifted entirely. There was no pretense of exhaustion, no plausible deniability. I walked to the bedroom, and he followed. I got into my side of the bed, and he got into his. For a long moment, we just lay there in the dark, on our separate sides, the space between us feeling like a vast, uncharted territory. Then, I felt the bed shift. He turned to face me. "Jules?" he whispered into the darkness. "Yeah." I whispered back. "Can I?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "Yes," I said. He moved across the small distance, his body fitting against mine as if it were made to be there. He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close, his head resting in the familiar curve of my neck and shoulder. But this time, it was not an accident of sleep. It was a choice. It was an intentional act of closeness. I rested my hand on his arm, my fingers curling around his. There was no fear, no frantic analysis. There was just a quiet, profound sense of rightness. This was no longer a stolen intimacy. It was a given one. We started to build a new set of rituals, ones based on honesty instead of ambiguity. The bedroom door was no longer left ajar as a question. It was simply left open as a fact of our shared space. His toothbrush found a permanent home in the holder next to mine. His clothes mingled with my own in the closet. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, slowly, beautifully, became our home. He started to bring his life into my space, not just his weary body. He brought his laptop and worked from my kitchen table, the clatter of his keys becoming a comforting background noise to my day. He cooked for me, filling my apartment with the smells of garlic and basil, his movements in my small kitchen confident and sure. He was learning how to be still, and I was learning how to embrace the gentle, happy chaos of his presence. We learned a new language of touch. It was in the way he would reach for my hand when we were walking down the street, his fingers lacing through mine without hesitation. It was in the way I would lean my head on his shoulder while we read on the couch, no longer needing the pretense of a movie. It was in the soft, sleepy kisses we exchanged in the morning light, kisses that tasted of coffee and certainty. It was in the quiet moments, the in-between spaces, that our love story was truly being written. It wasn't a grand, sweeping epic. It was a series of quiet, intimate snapshots. Leo making coffee in my kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts. Me, developing photos in the darkroom, and him sitting quietly in the corner, just wanting to be near. The two of us, asleep in our bed, his arm a familiar, comforting weight around me. One Saturday afternoon, months later, we were lying on the couch in a tangle of limbs, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. A book lay forgotten on his chest. I was tracing the lines on his palm with my finger. A comfortable silence settled between us. He was looking at me, a soft, thoughtful expression on his face. "You never answered me," he said quietly. I looked up, confused. "Answered what?" He smiled, a slow, gentle curve of his lips. "That night, on this couch, I asked if you were happy." I felt a slow warmth spread through my chest. I thought back to that night, to the fear and the desperation, to the feeling that my world was about to end. And I looked at him now, at the man who had been my friend, my secret love, my source of pain, and was now, simply, my home. I leaned in and kissed him, a slow, lingering kiss filled with a peace I had never known was possible. I pulled back and looked into his clear, hazel eyes. "Yes," I said. It was the truest thing I had ever said. We learned, in time, that a home is not a place you build according to a pre-written plan. It's a structure you create together, moment by moment, out of honesty and vulnerability. It's a quiet space you build in the heart of the world, where you can be scared together and safe together. We had found our way across the threshold, not into a new and unfamiliar world, but into a place that had been waiting for us all along, hidden in plain sight, disguised as something ordinary. We had simply needed to be brave enough and honest enough to finally open the door and walk through it, together. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create, we began to heal.